Government and politics and bureaucracy is not a topic that I like talking about very much, at least not with anybody else besides myself. I think I've said this a few times before in the past, that if you had to pick the one topic in our country today that has the greatest potential for generating a lot of heat and very little light, it would be political talk. Certainly religion is up there also, and there are, on occasions, I do war with myself over which one is the more controversial subject. So I will do what I can to enter into this topic as objectively as possible. Those of you who know me well enough, I am an equal opportunity basher when it comes to all sides of the political aisle. But I would like to begin with a warning to everybody out here. And the first warning I'd like to give is to everybody out there who would consider yourself to be on the left side of the political spectrum, liberal, progressive, whatever word you want to use there. And that warning is this, that evil did not begin in this country with the election of George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, or Calvin Coolidge. It needs to be remembered that evil began a long time before their parents were even a gleam in their parents' eyes. Okay? Things didn't just automatically go to Hades in a handbasket when your least favorite person was elected. Evil has been around a long time before that. If you are someone who, like myself, leans on the political right of the spectrum, conservative, whatever word you want to use there, I would like to say this to you, that evil did not begin in this country with the election of Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, or Franklin Roosevelt. Evil began a long time before their parents were even a gleam in their parents' eyes. Frankly, I have just a little bit more before I get into the text here. I would like to say just a little bit more to those who consider themselves politically conservative, because I think there are some major misconceptions that are easy to fall into. It's very easy to make the mistake of believing that when someone declares themselves to be a political conservative, that automatically means that they are a Christian, or at least an ally of Christian principles. And I think that this is a major mistake for one major reason, and that is that the vast majority of conservatives in government are just as humanistic and atheistic in their thinking as the vast majority of liberals. If you don't mind, I'd like to read for you a paragraph or two from one of my favorite books. Dr. Henry Morris wrote a book called The Long War Against God. It's actually a very interesting history over the creation-evolution debate and how the whole debate, especially evolution, has gone into every area of our lives. Let me quickly read this. It is a mistake to assume, as many do, that political conservatism is necessarily compatible with biblical Christianity. For example, Robert Welch, founder of the rightist John Birch Society, was a strong evolutionist, as were many of its other early leaders. Similarly, many leaders in the present-day Republican Party, i.e. the Rockefellers and other leaders in Wall Street, are really the spiritual heirs of 19th century social Darwinists. Most of them are firmly committed to evolutionism and the amassing of great fortunes by whatever methods will succeed in the economic struggle for existence. The recent betrayal, and when he wrote this book, I wanted to say he wrote this book around 1998. So when you hear recent, just remember he's writing this from the viewpoint of 1998. The recent betrayal of the religious right is a painful reminder of this fact to disillusioned Christians. This group joined forces with the ostensibly conservative Republican establishment in order to help restore traditional Americanism, i.e. family values, prayer, creationism in schools, sexual morality in society, etc., and to elect Ronald Reagan as president. Its members then saw their own concerns ignored in favor of a concentration on economic measures designed to restore a greater degree of Darwinist laissez-faire capitalism. Bible-believing Christians today must not forget that most political conservatives are still evolutionists, especially those in prominent positions, just as most political and religious liberals and as such, they have their own agenda. I firmly believe that we are being fooled by the humanistic right. We're being backed into a corner from which we are only given one choice when it comes to our vote and our support. Of course, that's not surprising given the nature of our leaders. So with all that said out of the way, I'd like everybody in here to please turn with me to my favorite Old Testament book, the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. We're just going to, actually, take that back, 8, 9, and 10. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses 8, 9, and 10, where the teacher is going to have some very dry and realistic comments to make. I'll be reading from the NIV. The teacher says, "If you see the poor oppressed in a district, and justice and rights denied, do not be surprised at such things. For one official is eyed by a higher one, and over them are both are others higher still. The increase from the land is taken by all. The king himself profits from the fields. Whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is meaningless." Verse 8, the teacher gives a realistic view of our world. What he simply says, do not be surprised when you see oppression and corruption. Why does the teacher say this? Because he realizes a fundamental problem with government in general, and that problem is the nature of bureaucracy. What is bureaucracy? I think it could be simply defined as having many, many officials who preside over many different departments of responsibilities. There are multiple bureaucrats, officials in every department, and there are many departments established for just about every occasion. In Proverbs chapter 28, verse 2, the writer of this proverb made the comment that when a country is rebellious, it has many rulers. Why are there many princes? Why are there many government officials when a country is rebellious? Well, you have to have many bureaucrats and many government officials in order to control the wickedness of the people. The more wicked the people are, the more laws you have to have in place. The more laws you have in place, the more people you have to have in order to be able to enforce those laws. And in turn, it costs the country more money to pay those bureaucrats, resulting in deficits. Many rulers is easily a reference to bureaucrats and massive levels of government. Anybody in here familiar with the Beetle Bailey comic strip? Many of you in here are. One of my all-time favorite ones, I don't think it was one that was actually published in the Sunday paper, but when I was a teenager, we had several Beetle Bailey comic books. This particular one, Beetle asks Sergeant Snorkel, "Hey, can I plant a couple of watermelon seeds next to the barracks?" Sarge says, "Well, gee, I don't know. I don't see any reason why not, but we better go get the captain's permission just to make sure it's okay." So Snorkel and the captain get together in the captain's office, and they don't really know what to do. They're looking at the Army regulations. Well, this regulation says that you can't use Army grounds for personal benefit, but over here it says that you should make attempts to beautify Army grounds whenever possible. Well, gee, I don't know. We better call the major and see what he has to say. So they call the major. The major doesn't have a clue what to do. A watermelon patch? I don't know about this. Give me the general. So he calls the general up, and the general half-track is just up in arms. I don't know what in the world to do about a watermelon patch. As he's up in arms talking about this, he gets a call from his secretary. The Pentagon's on the phone for you, sir. And the second to last panel in that comic strip shows a picture of the Pentagon, little bubble coming out of there. The chief says that it's okay for you to proceed with the watermelon farm project. The very last panel of that comic strip shows Beetle planting some watermelon seeds, and behind him, General Half-Track and the captain and Sergeant Snorkel are dressed in their dress blues with an Army band playing behind them. All he wanted to do was plant a couple of watermelon seeds, and it went all the way up to the president in order to be able to gain permission to do this. Guys, that's bureaucracy. It's a funny way of putting it. It's no wonder that I like that one so much. But it's a classic story, isn't it? What happens in verse 8 is that the little guy is oppressed, and no matter where he goes or what he does, it's impossible for him to get justice because no one's going to hear his case. Why is that? Because most of the time the bureaucrat's not going to listen to him, and on the rare occasions when he does find a bureaucrat that will listen to him, there is someone above him that's going to thwart his efforts. Oppression and injustice end up being proactive. In other words, there's proactive and there's reactive. You know, if you react to something, that means somebody does something to you first and you react to it. Proactive simply means you take the first step, that you take the first action. So it's the leaders that oppress and deny justice. Why? Well, because wicked men sit at the seat of judgment. That's why. The teacher already said this. If you look back in chapter 3, verse 16, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of judgment, justice, wickedness was there. One pastor calls this a food chain, proverbial food chain. The bureaucrats above that of the ones that the little guy goes to, they keep an eye on the lower ones so that the chain of corruption and money doesn't get interrupted, doesn't get broken. And furthermore, we need to remember that for the most part, not in every case, mind you, but many, unfortunately, in power today do not consider justice to be the end of itself. They look at justice as being a tool. How many of you here remember Jesus' parable of the unjust judge? A poor widow goes to this judge who cared not about God nor about men and kept pestering him for justice. And for the longest time, he kept refusing. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. Until what happened? He got so tired that he basically said, you know what? I don't care about God. I don't care about men. But I'm going to get her justice because otherwise she's going to wear me out. Did the judge in Jesus' story give the widow justice because it was the right thing to do? Or did he do so because he didn't want to be worn out by her cries for justice? Obviously, guys, we cannot read the hearts of people. We talked about this in our class. It's impossible to read the motives of what goes on in anybody. And bureaucrats and politicians are not the only ones that fall into this trap. I can't read what's going on in Steve's mind right now any more than he can read what's going on in mine. But nevertheless, we have to make sure that we do have to ask ourselves the same question. And this is where I'm kind of getting nervous here, because normally I don't get nervous in speaking, but I also recognize I'm going to be making a lot of assertions here, and I'm getting a little nervous doing so, but I feel like I've got to plow forward. We have to ask ourselves the question, do politicians act justly and right because they genuinely care, or do they act justly and love mercy because it's the politically expedient thing to do so they can get reelected? As I said a second ago, not every judge or bureaucrat is going to think like this. Obviously, we need to be very careful that we don't stereotype everybody into one massive lump. There are exceptions to the rule. Maybe even the exceptions are more than the rule. But unfortunately, we're going to run into this enough that it's going to stifle any true achievement of justice within the system. And mind you guys, it's not just government and bureaucracy that fall into this trap either. Any organization can fall into the trap of injustice and oppression. Unfortunately, even churches can fall into that example, where the elders and the pastor and so on use their power to basically force you to come here, and you have to abide by our tenets, otherwise you're going to be lost. I appreciate the Church of God of the Abrahamic faith, for the most part, not being like that, or at least I don't think that they are. We don't force anybody to be here, and I'm certainly not going to stand in front of you and say that if you don't go to this church right here, you're going to be eternally condemned and eternally lost. I say to you, use your brain and read your Bible and see what it has to say. And if you decide to come here, that's wonderful. We love to have you here. My friend Richard, who works for a cleaning service, a major cleaning service, gave me a good example of injustice and oppression that happened within his business. He had a friend of his who's a salesman. And every year, this salesman had a particular account where after he took care of this account once per year, he received a sizable commission from it. He got paid by a percentage. And as a result of the percentage, he would get a check after taxes for somewhere in the neighborhood of about $5,000 to $6,000 a year, a sizable amount of money. Okay? Well, about 2 years ago, Richard told me that this particular salesman got his check after he took care of that same account that he'd been taking care of for several years, but the check was only $1,000. The contract hadn't changed. He was supposed to receive a percentage, and the percentage should have been in the neighborhood of around $5,500 that year. So the salesman went to the management at this company, told him, hey, what in the world is going on? And the management fixed it for him. You know how they fixed it? They took away his account. Problem solved. Rather than doing the right thing, they took the account completely away from him so that he would have no more reason to complain. Unfortunately, injustice and oppression can happen in your job, in your life, even in the church. One commentator wrote these words that, true to the standpoint of this book, the comment on this is dry and realistic, and I hope and pray that I'm trying to be the same thing here. I'm just trying to be dry and realistic. I know a lot of you people out there think that I'm dry. I'm trying to be realistic too. After all, if we are looking at the world on its own terms of thoroughgoing secularism, we can't expect too high of a moral tone, either from the system we find in force or from any other. For all of his hatred of injustice, the teacher pins no hope on utopian schemes or on revolution. He knows what is in man. In other words, what he's saying here is that if we just look at government, if we look at bureaucracy just strictly from a secular viewpoint, it's unrealistic to expect a very high moral tone. It is. I mean, animals don't treat each other with any moral impunity, do they? My friend Dick Eldred once said, you can't expect regenerate behavior from an unregenerate person. This is not to say that an unregenerate person can't act good once in a while. This is not to say that an unregenerate person can't do right sometimes. It's just simply that's not the default position. The default position, and I hate to say this, is that when you're dealing with an unregenerate person, when you're dealing with a non-believer, you have to assume wickedness comes out of them. Are we making the mistake of expecting too much from our government given this? Of course, that's a question only you can answer. I'm not going to answer it for you. In verse 9, this is actually one of the few verses from my reading in Ecclesiastes. This is one of the few verses in the entire Bible where we may never actually know what the true meaning of this verse is because of the way that the Hebrew reads. I've seen one of three ways that this verse can possibly be translated. The first way, and I believe that the NASB conveys this, is that an advantage to the land is this, a king over cultivated fields. In other words, if it can be translated this way, what it means is that no matter how bad the government is, it's better to have a tyrant over you than anarchy. Now, it's a heck of a choice to make. But if you had to choose between having a government that was oppressive and took away your rights, or living in a land where there were no rules, no laws, no jail, no police force, and everybody did as they saw fit, which one would you rather live in? Solomon here is saying that it's better to live in a tyrannical government because at least there's law and order. Again, though, what a choice. Another way that I've seen it translated is the way that the NIV, the way that I just read it out of here, that the increase from the land is taken by awe, the king himself profits from the fields. In other words, if this is the way that this verse can be translated, then that means that corruption goes all the way to the top. Even the king reaps the benefits of corruption from government and bureaucracy. The third way that I've seen it is that I think that this is the way that the King James Version reads, moreover, the profit of the earth is for all, the king himself is served by the field. The Today's English Version paraphrase translates this verse, even the king depends on the harvest. In other words, even the king himself is dependent on agriculture in the fields. The king has to have the common man do his job in order for the king to have any power at all. I mean, let me pick on somebody in here. If Jetty wanted to call herself Queen Jetty, but no one obeys her or listens to her, then what good does her title do? She has to have subjects in order for her title to mean anything. Even the king depends on the harvest. You know, the meaning of this passage could be altered in a minor way depending on how you look at it, but I think that the central thrust of this passage still holds true regardless of which way you take. And that is that oppression, injustice, and corruption are realities of life and are going to be a source of frustration and disillusionment for man. Why can't the government be changed by the well-meaning? The problem is that the government is fundamentally bureaucratic. That's why. Bureaucracy goes all the way to the top. It goes round and round. Every level watches over the other. Justice does not come naturally in a government that's heavily bureaucratic. And again, that comes back to us, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But until the bureaucracy can be shaken up or eliminated, government's not ever going to be able to change. We lament that we want government to change. We want it to get better. Well, as long as we're fundamentally bureaucratic, that's not going to happen. The problem with bureaucrats is that they're firmly entrenched in their positions. If you don't believe this to be the case, then try voting one out of office. Try voting the representative from the Department of Justice out of office. Try to vote the guy at the desk at the Department of Energy out of office. It can't be done. By the way, guys, this is why if you read Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution of the United States, it says right there that all lawmaking powers rests in Congress, and Congress alone. You know why that's the case? It's very simple. Because if Congress passes a law that you don't like, you can always vote that person out of office and bring in somebody else. That's all there is to it. It was done in order to hold our leaders accountable. But today, I got to be careful when I say today, it's been like this for a long time. It didn't just happen, 3 years ago or 6 years ago. Congress has given their lawmaking power to the president and to his departments. You could vote the president out of office, but how are you going to be able to vote the Department of Justice representative out of his office? He passes an edict down and you have nothing you can do about it. But I also need to bring up another very important point. That in our form of government, we have a Democratic-Republican form of government. I call it Democrat-Republican because we are first and foremost a constitutional republic ruled by laws and ruled by representatives, but we still have democratic elements in the sense that we can select our leaders. But we will never see an improvement in our leaders until we first see an improvement in the people. We will never see an improvement in our leaders until we, the people, get better. Why is this the case? Well, we're going to vote for people that share our values. That's why. If I had one of the great examples of irony that I can come up with in my life comes from the fact that we, the people who are corrupt and unjust, we elect leaders who are corrupt and unjust, who go and act corruptly and unjustly, and then we, the people, wonder why we, the people, are the victims of corruption and injustice. Am I the only one in here who finds something weird about that? What else did you expect? Why are we shocked? Why are we surprised when unjust people act unjust? Why do the actions of the ungodly surprise us? As long as the United States of America is in rebellion against God, we're going to have more bureaucracy and more levels of government that's going to devour more and more of the people's sustenance. You may be saying to yourself, you're on a big-time pessimistic rant, aren't you, Brother Lonnie? I'm not being pessimistic. I'm being realistic about life. It's not being pessimistic to tell the truth. This is what happens, and we've got to deal with this. We've got to deal with it and accept the fact, and I don't like saying this either, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway, and I know it's getting recorded for the whole world to see. We've got to remember the fact that far more often than not, government's going to be our enemy and our oppressor no matter where or when we may live. Regardless of your political persuasion. I don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. This does not take away from our responsibility, however, to give honor due to those, to our rulers. I take Romans 13 very seriously when he says that we should submit to the authorities and that the authorities have been established by God for our good. I am not saying that this takes away from our responsibility to use whatever power or influence we may have been given to try to change the course of said government. And in no way, shape, or form is this a call for us to be silent or to stay away from the political realm. What I'm simply saying is that this is a warning that those that we honor will probably not honor us, unless, of course, those that we honor are campaigning for our vote. You got time for a joke? Not politically incorrect, a doctrinally incorrect joke, so please forgive me. A few of you I've already told this to, but I'll go ahead and tell it to you now. About a man who dies, and he meets St. Peter at the pearly gates. And St. Peter says, "Son, we're doing things a little bit different today. We're going to give you the opportunity to spend a day in heaven and a day in hell. And after that day in each, you can decide from there where you'd like to spend eternity. Okay, that sounds good. So he spends his first day up in heaven. Heaven's a beautiful place, very, very nice, very pleasant to be up there. Wonderful place to be. So after that day is over with, he goes down into hell. But man, when he gets down into hell, nothing like he was told. It's beautiful down there. Lush green meadows, golf courses, a nice cool breeze wafting through, and he sees his friends down there playing golf and drinking coffee and eating donuts and just having a wonderful time. And the devil comes up to him and slaps him on the back and says, hey, welcome to hell. Come on in, enjoy yourself. And he just has a wonderful time down there. So he spends the whole day and comes back up to St. Peter the next day and says, well, Peter, I've made my decision. I think I'd like to stay in hell for eternity. I mean, don't get me wrong, heaven is real nice and all that, but all my friends are down there and it's really nice, and I think I'd like to go there. So Peter says, okay, go ahead. So he goes back down into hell. But when he gets down there, he discovers that it was nothing like the day before. It's now barren, hot, people are screaming in pain and suffering, and stereotypical pictures of hell, right? Completely bewildered, he goes up to the devil and says, hey, wait a minute, yesterday things were so great, but now it's like this. What's going on? The devil looks at him, pats him on the shoulder, and says, son, yesterday was our campaign. Today you voted for us. Yesterday was our campaign. Today you voted for us. Why will the government not honor its subjects? The reason is because the government will not view its constituents as people to be protected, but instead as sheep to be sheared. And this leads me into verse 10. Verse 10 of chapter 5, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. The lover of money never has enough. We talked a little bit about covetousness and wanting more and wanting more. He will do whatever he can to get more and more. And if this means he has to bilk more money from his subjects in order to satisfy his lust for money, then that's what he's going to do. I like what one commentator said. He said that the oppression of the poor, the wrestling of justice, need cause no surprise, for those injustices are a direct result of the insatiable disposition to acquire wealth. I now just talked to you for about 28 minutes about what the problem is. I'm willing to wager that much of what I have said is probably intuitive to you. Probably everybody in here at one time or another have thought similar things or have said similar things, if not the same thing that I've just said right now. So what in the world do we do? Because if I just ended the message right here, sang our last song and broke up, well, that wouldn't really exactly be, I wouldn't exactly be doing you guys a whole lot of justice, would I? Of course, didn't we just read a second ago that injustice will happen? So I could go ahead and just wrap it up right now, but I'm not going to. There are some things that I think that we can do under the sun. Some of them you may not like, some of them you will. The first thing to remember, we need to learn to pray for our leaders, and I'm going to emphasize the word, we need to pray for every single one of our leaders. And yes, guys, that means praying for the guy or the gal that you didn't vote for. That means praying that God will use your quote-unquote political enemy to further his will for the good of this country. Don't trust princes. Number 2. Don't put your faith in mere men and women who are fallen by their very nature. Guys, can I please ask everybody in here for a favor? And that is, stop being surprised and stop being shocked when wicked men act wickedly. Don't take me the wrong way. I'm not saying you shouldn't be outraged. I'm not saying you shouldn't try to do something about it. But I'm telling you right now, I cannot tell you how many times in listening to my radio and hearing some of the comments, whether it be from guys like Glenn Beck or Mark Levin, or whether it be some of the guys on the AFR network like Brian Fisher and Crane Durham, I can't imagine how many times I hear them say, this is shocking, this is surprising, I can't believe that such and such would have done this. It's inconceivable. Guys, knock that off. Of course it's conceivable. Wicked men will do wicked things. Stop being surprised. Don't have a heart attack every time you see something ungodly come down the pike. Guys, if you have a heart attack or a stroke every time injustice comes down the system, you're not going to do anybody any good because you're going to be dead. Isn't that the normal result of a heart attack? You're dead. And guess what? When you're dead, you're not going to do anybody any good. So stop being surprised when you see wickedness happen. Number 3, be involved, but be realistic about your involvement. The platitudes and the, what's the other word that I want to look for? I can't think of it off the top of my head. The idea that you and I have been given a privilege by living in this country and being able to have your voice heard by casting your vote is a true one. Those of us who are over 18, I certainly hope and pray that you will register and you will go out and vote regardless of who it is you may vote for. It's my hope that when you kids get to be the age of 18 that you'll do the same thing, because we have been given a great privilege to be able to have our voice heard in this country. Maybe you are one of those in here, maybe you're feeling the tug of running for office, city council or school board or something bigger. If you are, regardless of how you may feel about things, you know what I tell you? Go for it. Run. We had a couple of young men who are currently serving in the Arkansas State Legislature right now who grew up in this church, David and Stephen Meeks, who felt the call that they needed to run for office and be able to go there in order to try to make things right. Regardless of whether they succeed or not, they followed that desire, they followed that urge, and there they are. Now, guys, we need to pray very hard for them because they're in the lion's den. But nevertheless, I would never tell somebody who had the urge to run for political office to not do so. If that's where God is calling you to do it, whether you win or whether you lose. You know, there have been cases of righteous men and women who were able to work in the system and accomplish good. Anybody in here know who William Wilberforce was? Handful of you know who he was? He was a member of the House of Commons, I believe, in Great Britain in the early 1800s, who fought tooth and nail to stop the slave trade in England. This guy, he endured so much. From what little I knew about him, he endured so much ridicule, so much oppression from others around him. His health failed. But through all of that, he fought and he fought and he fought and he fought. And finally, a few days before he died, he was able to get legislation passed through the government of Britain outlawing the slave trade. He felt very strongly to do this. And in a sense, it costed him his life. But he was able to get in there and he was able to do good, even in a system that is occupied by corruption and injustice. Don't think it can't be done. With God's help, it can be done. Who's to say you're not going to end up being the exception to the rule? Be realistic about how things are going. I mentioned the AFR Talk Network a second ago. The guy that's on the afternoons from 1 to 3 is a fellow named Brian Fisher, who one of his common refrains that he will say about once or twice during a show is that he says that, remember, we are fighting a winnable war. On a certain level, I would agree with Brian Fisher. On another level, I would say that no, he's wrong. If you look at how things are going from a short-term perspective, I firmly believe that we can win in government, that we can, on some certain level, be able to establish right, to be able to establish godly principles. But I will also say that if you look at it from a long-term perspective, human nature is always going to reassert itself and wipe out whatever gains you have made. Good leaders are eventually going to die, and those good leaders will be replaced by wickedness. If I can use a controversial example of this, the whole issue, the whole controversy that's going on in our country over the last who knows how many years over the issue of homosexual marriage is a good example of this. From a short-term perspective, traditional marriage is winning, isn't it? How many will we have? 32 states in this country now that have a constitutional amendment to their state constitution that defines marriage as being between one man and one woman. So in the short term, that's a good thing. But in the long term, I'm telling you that these laws one day are going to be overturned. Now, it may take 2 or 3 generations. We may not see it until after these guys here get married and have their kids and they grow up. But it's going to happen. Why? Because one thing that I've learned about human nature is this, guys. And you don't have to look at just at government in order to understand this. Human nature, and I include myself in this category, human nature is inherently selfish. It's spoiled and thinks that it should be able to experience anything that it wishes at any time that it wishes. And I have also noticed about human nature that it constantly advances towards greater and greater sin. And sooner or later, I have seen throughout history, that desire will smash any barrier that you try to set up in front of it, with one exception. And that one exception, of course, is Jesus Christ. The one man who can stop the advance of our sin if we will allow him to do so. Amen. Don't allow what may happen in the future to stop you from doing the right thing today. You know, Jesus himself said in the Sermon on the Mount, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to have enough trouble of its own. Let each day be enough for that day. Tomorrow doesn't exist yet. You can only worry about here and now. You can only do right and you can only do good here and now. But don't let what might happen tomorrow stop you from doing right and doing good today. We are called to obey God in everything that we do. Live the kind of life that you would want others to live. You know, guys, we may never see the day come in this country outside of a revolution, and I hope that doesn't happen. But we may never see the day when our government is going to reduce its spending and drop the deficits and lower the national debt. We may not see that day happen. But guys, that doesn't mean that you, here and now, can't be smart with your money. Guys, if you're in credit card debt right now, or if you owe money on your cards, get them paid off. Get rid of that debt. If you owe anybody anything, get out of it. Let no debt remain outstanding to you except for one, and that debt is to love one another. You may never see the divorce rate drop, but that doesn't mean that you can't improve on your own marriage and you can't work on your own marriage. We may never see our culture be responsible when it comes to moral issues like sexual immorality or theft or lying, but that doesn't mean that we can't be holy today, here and now, can it? Let's start living the kind of life that God wants us to live. I promise I'm finishing up, guys. Last of all, one of the most difficult things that I think that we can do is to keep ourselves from being embittered because of the evil that stems from our government. Have you found it very easy to get bitter about someone or something? Lord knows I have. Oh, and I'm ashamed of it too. Should we do what we can to fight injustice? Yes. You know, one of the issues about this particular passage that we read for you in Ecclesiastes, many commentators will look at this and they'll say that, you know, he doesn't say anything about fighting oppression. He doesn't say anything about actually doing it. So that must mean that we shouldn't bother doing anything at all. This is what some people would call an argument from silence. True, the teacher does not say specifically in this passage to fight injustice, but I would also like to point out that he never tells us to do nothing. He never tells us to do nothing, guys. All he's doing is simply telling us not to be surprised when we see an injustice or oppression happen through the system. I mean, is it necessary that shock and surprise always has to accompany action? Do we always have to just throw our hands in the air and say, oh, I can't believe that they would do that. I better do something about it. No, what we should be saying is, that happened. I need to make my voice heard and fight against that. We are not called to be bitter, not called to be angry. We are especially not called to be surprised. Guys, we are called to be righteous. And we need to remember that no matter how bad things are, everything that happens in this world is being played right in to God the Father's hands. There is no plan that man can come up with that is going to thwart what the Lord God is going to do with us and in this world. If I may use a poker analogy, we shouldn't be shocked and surprised when our opponent lays down his hand and we see that he has 4 aces and that he's going to win the pot. You know what we need to do? We need to put our cards down, accept that loss when it happens, and have the next hand dealt to us. Because guess what? The enemy has a limited bankroll. Our Father in heaven has an unlimited bankroll. And sooner or later, our enemy will run out of money. It may take a while, but it will happen. One day, sin will no longer rule over us. Sin will be eternally extinguished. Then we will have a perfect and righteous government that knows no oppression, injustice, corruption, or self-centeredness. We will have a man on the throne one day that is going to rule this world in the way that God wants this world to be ruled. And I look forward to that day when it comes. However, in the meantime, we're still living in this world under the sun with wickedness. Let's learn not to be bitter. Let's learn not to be frustrated. Let's learn not to be surprised. But let's also use what God has given us to make sure that in our own ways, in our own lives, we can be men and women who show and exhibit the righteousness and the love and the holiness of God through Jesus Christ to others, no matter what their situation may be.